I'll tell you a little story. This is in my book. So I had this landlord in Montreal. He lived next door to me. And he was an ex-Hells Angels biker. He'd spent a lot of time in prison. And his wife had borderline personality disorder, and she committed suicide when I lived there. And he was a rough guy, and he was a Quebecois. He spoke Joual, which I could hardly understand. And he didn't really know what to make of me, and I didn't really know what to make of him. But we got along, you know. And I was very careful talking to him, as you might imagine. But I was very, and we went over, my wife and I went over there, and we had spaghetti dinner one night, and we sort of communicated. And I bought a poster from him because he made these wooden posters that had neon on them, and that's how he made a living. He'd kind of trained himself to be a bit of an electronics guy, and so he made these things. And he was trying to quit drinking, and we talked about that. He was a lot older than me. He was like 20 years older than me. I was about 25 at this point. And we got along pretty well. But every now and then he'd go out and drink. And he could really drink, you know, like he was one of these guys who could drink like 60 beer. And you think, well, no one can drink that much, and you're wrong. I studied alcohol for like 10 years. Some of my subjects' fathers drank 40 ounces of vodka a day and had been doing it for 20 years. So you can drink a lot, and he could drink a lot. And what would happen, he was trying to not drink, but he'd go out and go on a binge, and then he'd be gone for like 3 days. And he'd drink up all his money, and then we'd hear him out in the backyard howling at the moon with this little ugly dog he had, you know. And he'd howl, and the dog would howl, and he'd howl, and the dog would howl. And it was rather unsettling and made my wife nervous. And but worse, you know, now and then he'd come to the door at like 3 a.m, and he'd knock on the door, and he'd be standing there. And I don't know how much experience you've had with rough guys who are alcoholic and who are drunk, but they can be upright and unconscious at the same time. And so that was the state that he was in, you know. He'd be just swaying. And he'd ask me if I would like to buy his toaster or his microwave, because he needed some money to keep drinking. And, you know, I didn't really want to buy his toaster or his microwave, but when the ex-Hells Angel, Joual-speaking, 60 beer drunk Quebecois biker shows up at your door at 3 a.m. and offers to sell you his microwave, the easiest thing is to say, I really need a microwave. So, you know, I bought the microwave and the toaster and some other things. But then my wife talked to me, and she liked my landlord, you know. Even though she was afraid of him, she liked him. And she said, you can't buy any more appliances because it's not good for him. And I thought, that's an interesting problem. You know, so what the hell am I going to do about this? Because no, I don't want to buy your microwave. Just doesn't seem to be the right answer at 3 a.m. So one time he took me out on his 750 Honda, and he put me on the back of it. He wanted to show me his lair, I guess, his hangouts. And I got his wife's helmet on, but it didn't fit. It just sit on the top of my head. And he said, I got on the bike and he said, if the cops chase us, we're not stopping. and then away we went. And we went to these bars downtown on Saint Laurent. They were very rough places. And he got into like 4 fights that night because he was a rough guy, you know, and these kind of punk guys would come up to him and sort of challenge him and act stupidly around him, and he was very skeptical. And if you were acting stupidly around him for any length of time, he'd just hit you because he felt that that's what you deserved, and perhaps he was right. You know, so I had first-hand opportunity to observe him. So anyways, he, sure enough, about a week or 2 after we had this conversation, he showed up at the door, knock, 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 you know. I opened the door, and he was standing there, you know, with his eyes kind of half closed, and he was swaying. And he had, I don't remember what the appliance was this time, but he wanted to sell it to me. And I said, Paul, I can't buy this. I'm not going to buy this because I know you're trying to quit drinking. And if I give you this money, then you're going to go and drink it up. And it's not going to be good for you. And what else did I tell him? I think I told him as well that this whole thing of him coming to my house at like 2 a.m. was scaring my wife, who he liked, and that it had to stop. And believe me, man, I was thinking about what I was saying, because he was watching me like a rough guy watches you. And a rough guy watches you like this. He thinks, if you say one thing that indicates contempt, you're going to bloody well pay for it. And so I was finding my words like, you know, I was crossing a swamp and trying to look for the rocks underneath the surface. And I said what I had to say very, very carefully. And he looked at me for about 15 seconds. And that's a long time to be looked at 3 in the morning. And he left. And he never came back to sell me anything again. And we got along fine. But that's a good illustration of this issue with regards to truth and success in the strange land, because I was in the strange land when I was talking to my neighbor, my landlord then, and I managed to say what was true carefully enough, so despite the fact that he was a very violent person, and that he was a very intoxicated person, and that he had every reason to be suspicious of me, and we couldn't communicate very well, and I didn't do what he wanted, that he took it, and he left, and there was no problem, and life went on just fine after that. And so, we don't want to underestimate the utility of establishing this bounded relationship with the ideal and attempting to live with some nobility in truth while aiming at the highest ideal. There's nothing about that that's anything but strengthening and positive. And it's exactly what you need to set against the catastrophe and uncertainty of life. By noon, the dragon filled the house. Its head hung out the front door. Its tail hung out the back door. And there wasn't a room in the house that didn't have some part of the dragon in it. I bet that there's a house like that on, some of you will live, you know, where there's a lot of houses. Some of you live in apartments. Doesn't really matter. But I bet you if you live in a house, on a block of houses, there's at least one house on that street where the tail of the dragon has started to come out of the house. And you know what that's like, because it's the house that you don't really want to look at when you walk by. You know, and maybe, I don't know, that needs a new roof, and like the door is a little bit crooked, and the lawn isn't cut, and you know, there's some rusty things lying around there, and like it's just not taken care of. And you know, and maybe you know from the gossip in the neighborhood too, that there's something going on in that house that is just not good. And it's got to the point where it's so not good that it's starting to spread itself out beyond the domestic confines of the house. So, you know, you run into people like that now and then too. You'll notice this. So, you know, sometimes, I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but it might have, it's happened to you in some ways. You know that there are those people who can't not tell you everything about what's going on in their life, even if you've hardly even met them. If you see someone who's really in trouble, you know, you'll sit on the bus and somebody who's clearly on the road to being thoroughly deranged will sit down beside you and they'll start telling you about the problems of their life. It's like, you know that the dragon that they're dealing with is so big that they can't even contain it. They're so desperate to have it dealt with that they can't not talk about it. You know, and there's lots of people like that. And they're the ones, what is that stupid little phrase? TMI, is that right? Too much information? It's like, yeah, well, why does that happen? It's because people are dealing with anomalies and unexpected occurrences and tragedies, and they cannot articulate a solution. And most people think by talking, which is also part of the reason that therapy works. It's right, well, do you think? I doubt it. You might, but very few people think. You know, and so if you want to solve a problem, you want to talk it over with a friend. And so, you know, you might just think that you're talking about the problem. Sort of, you know what the problem is, but you're talking about it. So you don't. When you talk about it, you articulate the problem space. You start to generate potential hypotheses about solutions. But more than that, if you're talking to someone, you can watch them just like the little kid with the mouse would watch the mother. It's like, well, here's what I think the problem is. And if you go, you know, you're listening and you go like that, you roll your eyes, you know, it's a hint to the person that maybe that's not the most appropriate way to formulate the problem. Now, maybe you don't roll your eyes, but, you know, you don't encourage them. Or maybe they tell you what the problem is and you're really actively engaged and you're nodding. Well, then they know that maybe they formulated it the way someone half sane and tolerable would formulate it. And then they can walk through the solution. So So when you sit down beside someone and they have to tell you everything, one of the things that you know is that they don't have anyone to listen to them. And part of what happens in therapy, and a huge part of it, is that you just listen. I have one client, that's all I ever do with her. She comes in once every 2 weeks, and I just sit there and listen to her for an hour. And now I can maybe have a bit of a discussion with her for the last 10 minutes. But if I try to say anything for the first 50 minutes, she just looks kind of irritated, and it's like I've interrupted the flow of the interaction. And she's alone. She doesn't have anybody to talk to. So, she wants to listen to herself think. And she can't do that by herself. She has to have someone to do it with. And so, people think by talking, and some people have no one to talk to, and so their problems start to spill out. And by that time you can't even help them usually, because if you listen for 3 years, it wouldn't be enough listening. You just listen forever and you never get to the bottom of it.